They made you stupid on purpose so you wouldn't question America's biggest child trafficking ring. At 8:30 this morning in room 437 of the California State Capitol, the Assembly Judiciary Committee heard testimony on SB 381. Every person who walked to that microphone asked for an aye vote. Adoptees, birth parents, adoptive parents, spouses, children of adoptees, the full human radius of what adoption actually does to a family, in one room speaking with one voice. Not one opposing witness. Not one person stood up to defend the status quo. Every member present signaled support. The formal vote didn't happen because there wasn't a quorum. Some of the chairs were empty. So tonight in California, an adult adoptee still cannot walk into a government office and request the birth certificate that was issued the day they were born. Not because anyone in that room today argued they shouldn't be able to, because not enough legislators showed up to count the vote. That is the system. That is what protecting it actually looks like in practice, not passionate opposition, not principled defense, just institutional inertia and empty chairs. And before you tell yourself this is a minor procedural hiccup on the way to an inevitable win, understand that the bill sitting in that committee today has been waiting in various forms since 1935. The chairs have been empty for 90 years. The document. Here is what most people do not actually understand about adoption, and it is not a metaphor or a political framing. It is the literal mechanics of a piece of paper. When a child is adopted in America, the original birth certificate, the one recording the actual mother's name, the actual time and place of birth, the actual biological facts of the day that child entered the world, is sealed by court order. Gone. Inaccessible without a judge's explicit permission, which can be denied, which often is denied, which requires a lawyer, a filing fee, a demonstrated good cause that a court decides is good enough. In its place, the state issues a new birth certificate, a fabricated one. It lists the adoptive parents in the spaces marked mother and father. It is printed on the same paper, stamped with the same authority, formatted identically to every other birth certificate in the system. Schools accept it, the passport office accepts it, the DMV accepts it, every institution in the country treats it as the original. Unaltered record of a birth that the people named on it did not witness and did not experience. The adoptive parents did not give birth. The government document says they did. That is not bureaucratic sloppiness. That is not an unintended consequence of a well-meaning policy. That is the system working exactly as it was designed to work. A manufactured legal fiction, given the same documentary weight as a hospital record, issued by the state, handed to a child young enough that by the time they are old enough to question it, they've been carrying it as their identity for decades. California Senator Aisha Wahab, the author of SB 381, has said it on the record to two separate committees this year. The sealing dates to 1935, done to protect adoptive families from societal stigma, not, as has been claimed for 90 years, to protect birth parents. The state's own legislative author, the person who has read the history of this policy more closely than anyone else in that building, is telling you the justification you've been given your whole life was never the real one. And if you think that's the worst of it, current California law, the law SB 381 is specifically trying to kill, allows adoptive parents to request an amended certificate that omits the city and county of birth and omits the race and color of the parents. Not redacts, omits, permanently removes from the document. A state-sanctioned mechanism for erasing a child's ancestry, their geographic origin, their racial identity. From the one piece of paper every government on earth requires you to produce to prove you exist. That is not 1935 history. That is operative California law in 2026, right now, while you are reading this sentence. The chapter the video didn't get to. You've probably seen the video by now, the Australian one, the one asking why Americans seem constitutionally incapable of critical thought. It traces the IQ testing regime to its eugenic roots, documents how it sorted children by presumed inherited worth and called it meritocracy, shows how the machinery survived long after the ideology that built it became unspeakable. It's a forensically accurate piece of work, and you should watch it. What it doesn't follow is that the exact same apparatus, same era, same intellectual network, same named figures, was running a parallel operation on a second population at the same time. Not children in classrooms, infants before they could speak. The video credits the Stanford testing machinery to Stanford psychologists, worth naming one of them directly, Louis Terman, who adapted the French Binet-Simon test into the Stanford Binet scale in 1916. Terman was a card-carrying member of the Human Betterment Foundation, the American Eugenics Society, and the Eugenics Research Association. He didn't use the test the way its French originators intended. to identify struggling students and get them more support. He used it to sort children on career tracks based on the premise that intelligence was fixed, inherited, and predictive of a person's worth to society. Stanford's own alumni magazine records that Terman endorsed a 1922 circular calling for action against threatened racial degeneracy. That's not an outside accusation. That's his own university's archive. Now meet the man who gave Terman's test its American reach. Henry Herbert Goddard translated the Binet test into English in 1908 and distributed roughly 22,000 copies across the country, making it the dominant institutional sorting tool in American schools, immigration screening, and courts for decades. He coined moron, imbecile, and idiot as the clinical classification bands. His Ellis Island studies declared that roughly 80% of tested Jewish, Hungarian, Italian, and Russian immigrants were feeble-minded, a finding now understood to reflect the exhaustion of people who had crossed an ocean in steerage and encountered a test built in English by white academics, but one that fed directly into the immigration restrictions of 1924 that effectively shut the door on Southern and Eastern European Jews. Goddard ran the Vineland Training School in New Jersey, and Goddard had opinions about adoption. On the record, published by his own institution in 1913, he called adoption a crime against those yet unborn, arguing that unmarried mothers were presumptively feeble-minded and that placing their children with families risked contaminating the gene pool. He advocated institutional segregation, keep the mothers in homes for the feeble-minded. Keep the children in institutions, because the alternative was letting hereditary defect propagate through the general population under the cover of a respectable family. The same man who built the test that sorted American schoolchildren by race and class was simultaneously publishing material that treated a child's illegitimate birth as a hereditary defect requiring institutional management rather than adoption into a family. That is not a metaphor for the connection between school tracking and adoption secrecy. That is one person, one institution, one documented body of work doing both at the same time. And the government wasn't watching from a distance, it was signing off. In 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court decided Buck v. Bell 8-1, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes writing the majority, upholding Virginia's compulsory sterilization law by invoking 3 generations of one family's presumed hereditary defect. The woman at the center of the case, Carrie Buck, was later established by historical research to almost certainly have had no hereditary impairment at all. Her institutionalization followed a rape by a relative of her foster family. Her daughter Vivian, used as evidence of a 3rd generation of imbecility, made the school honor roll before dying young of an intestinal disease. The Supreme Court sterilized a rape victim based on fabricated evidence of hereditary defect, wrote the opinion into constitutional law, and never took it back. The ruling remains valid precedent today. 24 more states passed similar laws in its wake, and the model sterilization law built by Harry Laughlin of the Eugenics Record Office, the same man who shaped the 1924 Immigration Act, the same network Terman and Goddard moved in, was later cited as a direct influence on Nazi Germany's hereditary health law. A fact significant enough that Nazi Defense Counsel invoked Holmes's opinion at the Nuremberg trials. This is the network that was running while the adoption system was being built, not a background influence, not a vague cultural climate. The same named people, the same documented institutions, the same legal architecture, operating simultaneously on schools, on immigration, on sterilization, and on the question of which infants were worth placing in families and which origins were worth erasing. The dominant adoption philosophy of the era was called matching theory. It paired a relinquished infant's presumed inherited traits, racial background, presumed intellectual level, family history of defect, with adoptive parents of similar stock, explicitly to produce families that looked as though the child had been born into them rather than placed. Prospective adoptive parents wrote to the Federal Children's Bureau asking for confirmation that a child's ancestry was free of hereditary disease. Genealogical investigation of grandparents and other natal relatives was standard placement practice, and the fabricated birth certificate, the one that erases the real mother and replaces her with the adoptive mother, is matching theory's administrative endpoint, not a side effect. The whole point: sort by heredity. Place accordingly, then issue the document that makes the fiction permanent and the truth inaccessible. The eugenics ideology became unspeakable after the world watched where it led in Germany. The certificates kept getting fabricated, the records kept getting sealed. The justification changed from explicit hereditary management to the softer language of stigma protection, family privacy, the child's best interests, but the mechanism was identical and the outcome was the same. A person who cannot access the documentary record of their own origin. Holding instead a piece of paper the state manufactured the day they were born. Australia don't look so innocent. Some of you reading this from Brisbane or Adelaide or Perth are feeling smug right now. This is an American pathology. You have socialized healthcare. You apologized. You're fine. You're not. Between 1950 and 1975, Australia ran its own baby scoop era. Not a version of it, not something resembling it, the same thing, running on the same timeline, producing the same outcomes, across the same Anglo-American institutional framework that built the American system in the first place. An estimated 150,000 to 250,000 Australian adoptions in that period involved coercion or the complete absence of informed consent. The 2012 Senate inquiry didn't soften that finding. Babies were taken illegally by doctors, nurses, social workers, and religious figures, sometimes working directly with adoption agencies, and handed to married couples judged more socially appropriate to raise them. Some mothers were coerced, some were sedated. Some signed documents under conditions the inquiry itself characterized as legally invalid. It was not only psychological damage. Women leaving these maternity wards were routinely given stilbostral to suppress lactation, a drug since linked to elevated cancer risk, infertility, and arthritis, not just in the women themselves, but in the children they subsequently had and in their grandchildren. That is a documented multigenerational physical harm chain, not metaphorical intergenerational trauma. Not the transmission of grief through attachment and silence. A chemical administered to a woman's body specifically to prevent it from doing what it was doing because a baby was being removed, and that chemical's consequences running forward through 3 generations of people who had nothing to do with the original transaction. The operative doctrine was clean break theory, the idea that complete severance of all biological connection, all paperwork trail, all possibility of future contact was in everyone's best interest. The birth mother's best interest, the adoptive family's best interest, the child's best interest. Nobody asked the child. Nobody asked the mother after the fact either. Clean break theory produced closed records, fabricated certificates, sealed files, and a presumption that the people most affected by the decision had no legitimate interest in revisiting it. Western Australia apologized in 2010. The federal government apologized in 2013. Julia Gillard stood at that dispatch box and acknowledged what the inquiry had found. The apology did not unseal the records, it did not undo the certificates, it did not give back the years spent not knowing, and it did not prevent the same institutional logic, clean break, closed records, fabricated documentation, from persisting in various forms in Australian states long after it became politically embarrassing to defend it openly. You ran this on your own soil with your own doctors, your own social workers, your own religious institutions. You called it welfare practice. You called it protecting everyone involved. You apologized when it became impossible not to, and then you kept the records closed because the apology was the end of your obligation as far as the system was concerned. An apology is not access. Saying sorry is not the same as handing someone the birth certificate that tells them who they actually are. Birth parents do not need protection from our children. In January, at the first Senate Health Committee hearing on SB 381, a woman named Susan Dushage Alexander testified. Transracial adoptee, birth mother who relinquished a child in 2001, licensed marriage and family therapist, executive director of a nonprofit that has spent over 20 years serving birth parents directly. She has stood on every side of the transaction this bill is trying to fix. She said, California birth parents do not need protection from our children. One sentence, 90 years of institutional justification gone. The entire architecture of we're protecting birth parent privacy built on a foundation that a birth parent just told you, on the record in committee, she never asked for and does not want. The protection was never for her. It was never for birth parents. It was for the system that needed the fiction to be airtight. And it used birth parents as the excuse because it sounded more sympathetic than we need the adoptive family to be able to pretend this child was born to them. No conspiracy required. Here is the part that should make you the angriest because it means there is no single target for the rage and no clean fix. You don't need a conspiracy when you have aligned incentives. Guatemala's intercountry adoption program was shut down after investigators documented systemic fraud, fabricated relinquishment paperwork, coerced birth mothers, children whose families were still alive, and looking for them being processed through an adoption pipeline that terminated in American living rooms because the demand was American, the money was American. And the documentation system had no meaningful incentive to ask hard questions about where the children came from. Nobody conspired. Agencies wanted children to place. Families wanted to adopt. Lawyers wanted fees. Government officials wanted bribes. The paperwork system wanted cases to close. Every single incentive pointed toward not looking too carefully, and so nobody did. And children were taken from families who were still alive and delivered to families who believed they were rescuing orphans. The same evangelical infrastructure that exports prosperity gospel God rewards your faith with wealth. Your pastor's private jet is divine favor. Your poverty is a spiritual failing, overlaps substantially with the religious organizations that ran adoption pipelines in Ethiopia and Uganda. Pipelines later documented by those countries' own authorities as involving fabricated orphan narratives and coerced relinquishment. Same theological framework. Same instruction to not interrogate institutional authority because institutional authority speaks for God. Same instruction to trust the process and not ask questions the process doesn't want asked. Different continent, identical machine. The flock was trained by Sunday school not to question the shepherd, and then a shepherd arrived who needed children. None of them sat in a room and planned it together. They didn't need to. The incentives were already pointing the same direction, and a population trained not to ask questions never demanded that they point any other way. A win and a limit. This morning, while that committee was sitting in Sacramento, the Supreme Court handed down its ruling in Trump v. Barbara 6-3, Chief Justice Roberts writing the majority, striking down Trump's executive order attempting to end birthright citizenship. The order would have stripped automatic citizenship from roughly 250,000 babies a year born to parents temporarily or unlawfully present in the United States. It never took effect. Every lower court that examined it called it what it was. Today, the Supreme Court confirmed it, unconstitutional, grounded in a misreading of the 14th Amendment that the court has rejected since 1898. That is a genuine win, a real one, worth saying clearly. Here is what it does not fix. The Child Citizenship Act of 2000 contains a cutoff date. Children who were adopted internationally and brought to the United States before the law's effective date in February 2001 did not receive automatic citizenship. They were supposed to be naturalized through the standard process. Tens of thousands of them were not. Their adoptive parents didn't file the paperwork or didn't know they needed to. Or assumed the government would handle it, which the government did not. Those people adopted as infants, raised in America, holding fabricated American birth certificates issued by the states they grew up in, Americans in every way they have ever understood themselves to be, have no citizenship. And under Operation True Parent, the Department of Homeland Security is now using that gap to deport them. People who were adopted into this country before they could walk, whose original birth certificates were sealed by the courts of their birth countries, who were handed fabricated American documents saying they were born here to American parents, are being removed from the country those documents say they're from because the paperwork that was supposed to follow the fabrication was never completed. The country fabricated the document that made them American and then deported them for not being American enough. Today's SCOTUS ruling protects future birthright citizens. It does not reach the people already caught in that gap. The Constitution held the line today. It held a narrower line than most of the people celebrating it understood. The numbers, because some of you need them, in rioting. The Hague Inter-Country Adoption Convention, the international framework supposedly regulating cross-border adoption, scores on the omission platform at current 66, true 88, delta plus 22. The omitted domains are identity continuity and genealogical access. The international gold standard for protecting adopted children has a structural blind spot precisely where this episode has been standing the entire time. The Child Citizenship Act of 2000, current 9, true 91, delta plus 82, the largest delta in the dataset, a law that scores 9 out of 100 on what it actually delivers against what it claims to guarantee, and that gap is now a deportation mechanism. Australia's former forced adoption policies and practices inquiry, current 81, true 88, delta plus 7, the smallest gap in the dataset, the one government that has actually closed most of the distance between what it claims and what it does. That matters, and it's worth saying. Then ask why most isn't all, why closed records persist in Australian states even after the apology, and what it means that the best score in the dataset still isn't a perfect one. California, in case you missed the memo. 16 American states have already passed unrestricted original birth certificate access for adoptees. 8 of them did it in the last 6 years. Georgia in 2025, South Dakota in 2023, Vermont, Massachusetts, Louisiana, and Connecticut in 2022, New York in 2019. Not one of them reported a determined fiscal impact. Not one of them collapsed under the weight of birth parent privacy claims that turned out, when tested, to be as hollow as Susan Dushage Alexander said they were. California, the state that leads on everything, the state that other states look to. The state currently trailing a national correction by the better part of a decade, still operating a law that lets adoptive parents erase a child's race from their birth record, still holding the original certificates in sealed court files, while every member of the committee charged with fixing it signaled support and then failed to constitute a quorum. The chairs were empty, that's where you are. Recognize the pattern. The video that started this conversation argued that America was deliberately engineered to produce people who can't think critically, that the school system, the media landscape, the political culture, the information environment were all shaped across 2 centuries by people with aligned incentives to produce a population that follows instructions rather than asks questions. It argued convincingly that this wasn't conspiracy. It was just what happens when enough powerful people benefit from the same outcome and no one is trained to notice. This is the chapter that video didn't write. The same network, same era, same named figures, same institutional logic, same government endorsement was building a parallel system for a smaller population, not students in classrooms, children at the moment of birth before they could speak, before they could ask, before they had any mechanism at all for interrogating the story they were being handed. The school system trained you not to question authority. The adoption system applied that logic to the document that establishes your identity before you're old enough to have one. Lewis Terman sorted you in school. Henry Goddard sorted you at birth. Oliver Wendell Holmes signed off on the premise that some origins are legitimate and others are a risk to the gene pool. The state issued a piece of paper that says your adoptive mother gave birth to you. It sealed the piece of paper that says she didn't. It told you this was for your protection. And then it couldn't even get enough legislators in a room to vote on giving you the document back. It wasn't a conspiracy, it was just a machine. And the machine kept running because a population trained not to ask questions never demanded that it stop. In room 437 today, people asked. Adoptees stood at that microphone and asked. Birth parents stood at that microphone and asked. Adoptive parents stood at that microphone and asked. Spouses and children of adoptees stood at that microphone and asked. The entire human arc of what this system does to people was in that room speaking, and not one person walked to that microphone to defend it. The chairs were still empty. Fill them.
I want you to put yourself in room 437 of the California State Capitol this morning. It's June 30th, 2026, and the Assembly Judiciary Committee is holding a hearing on Senate Bill 381.
Right.
Which is this piece of legislation designed to finally give adult adoptees in California access to their own original birth certificates. And if you're sitting in that room, what you're seeing is this incredible, almost unprecedented display of unity.
Yeah. It's total alignment. You have adoptees, you have birth parents, adoptive parents, spouses, even the children of adoptees. The entire human radius of the adoption experience is packed into this one room, and they are literally begging for this bill to pass.
Yeah.
Every single person who walks up to that microphone asks for an aye vote. There's not a single opposing witness. Not one person stands up to defend the status quo.
Right. So it looks like an absolute guaranteed slam dunk. I mean, every committee member present actually signals their support. But then the formal vote fails. And it doesn't fail because of some, passionate ideological debate or principled opposition. It fails because of a lack of a quorum. Basically, not enough legislators bothered to show up to count the vote. The chairs were just empty. So tonight, an adult adoptee in California still cannot walk into a government office and request the document that was issued the very day they were born.
And this isn't just some minor procedural hiccup for this specific legislative session, This exact battle in various forms has been waiting since 1935. So California adoptees have essentially been staring at empty chairs for 90 years.
90 years, exactly. So today, our mission for this deep dive is to forensically investigate this institutional paralysis. We're looking at a massive stack of historical records, legal documents, policy data, and they make a very specific, very heavily documented argument. It's an argument about why this system is so fiercely, fiercely protected.
Well, the core thesis we're examining today is striking because we often hear about the infrastructure of anti-intellectualism in this country, right? The eugenics era IQ testing, the rigid school tracking systems designed to sort populations.
Sure, the stuff from the viral "Why Are Americans So Bloody Stupid" video.
Exactly. But what the source material argues is that this educational sorting apparatus is not separate from the adoption records secrecy system. It is the exact same machine, built by the exact same historical figures, operating on the exact same institutional logic, with the exact same government endorsement.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to really understand the scale of what we're talking about, we have to start with the literal mechanics of the paperwork. Like, what actually happens to a person's identity on paper when they are adopted? Because I think a lot of people just assume it's a simple transfer of guardianship or something.
Yeah, we need to explain this plainly and bluntly, because it is usually clouded in all this euphemism. When a child is adopted in America, their original birth certificate, so the document recording the biological mother's name, the literal physical reality of the time and place of birth, that document is sealed by court order.
It just disappears.
Right. It is locked in a vault, whether physically or digitally, and it is rendered completely inaccessible. You cannot see it without a judge's explicit permission. And practically speaking, getting that permission requires legal fees, a lawyer, and a good cause that the court almost always denies. Wanting to know who you actually are is not legally considered good cause.
It's just wild.
Yeah.
And the state doesn't just leave a blank space in its records either. It issues a replacement,
Yeah.
a fabricated document.
Yeah.
This new certificate lists the adoptive parents in the spaces that are explicitly marked mother and father, asserting that they physically gave birth to this child.
Right.
And it's printed on the exact same official paper, stamped with the same state seal.
It is legally equivalent to the original in every single government and institutional context. The adoptive parents did not physically give birth to the child, but the foundational government document says they did.
It's as if, think about it like this. It's as if the government forces you to carry a counterfeit ID, but legally mandates that every institution, schools, the DMV, the passport office, treats it as the absolute unaltered truth of your existence.
Yeah.
You are handed this fake document before you can even speak. And by the time you're old enough to realize it's physically impossible, maybe because you don't look anything like your family, you've been living under its jurisdiction for decades.
And we really have to look at why this was designed this way. If you look at Senator Aisha Wahab's committee testimony this year, she's the author of SB 381, she explicitly points out that the sealing practice dates back to 1935.
Right.
And the historical record shows it was done to protect adoptive families from societal stigma. It was about shielding them from the judgment of raising a quote-unquote illegitimate child. It was not, as the public has been told for 90 years, designed to protect the privacy of birth parents. The state's own legislative author is putting on the record that the primary justification we've always heard was simply a cover story.
And if you think this is just some historical residue, like some outdated practice from the 1930s that we just haven't cleaned up yet, let's look at current California law in 2026. The actual law that SB 381 is actively trying to dismantle. Right now, current law allows adoptive parents to request an amended certificate that permanently omits the city and county of birth and permanently omits the race and color of the parents.
And let's be super clear on the mechanism here. It doesn't redact them with a black bar, it omits them entirely. If an adoptive family wants to pretend their child is of a different background to blend in better, they can legally just do that. It is a state-sanctioned mechanism for erasing a child's racial identity and geographic origin from the single piece of paper required to prove they exist in society.
Which obviously brings us to the biggest question. How did a system like this even get built? Because this level of systemic erasure doesn't just, materialize out of thin air. You might be listening to this and thinking this bureaucratic obsession with bloodlines and fake identity is just a weird quirk of family law. But the historical material connects this directly to the famous Stanford-Binet intelligence scale.
Right, the intelligence testing regime that was heavily utilized in the early 20th century. So the Stanford adaptation of the French Binet-Simon test was spearheaded in 1916 by a psychologist named Louis Terman.
And the paper trail on Terman's affiliations, it's wild. He was a documented card-carrying member of the Human Betterment Foundation, the American Eugenics Society, and the Eugenics Research Association. He didn't use his IQ test to identify students who needed extra tutoring.
No, not at all.
He used it to sort children onto fixed career tracks based on the premise that intelligence was inherited, fixed at birth, and dictated a person's fundamental worth to society.
What's fascinating here is how this testing apparatus actually spread and how it jumped from schools over to adoptions. Enter Henry Herbert Goddard. Goddard was the man who translated the Binet test into English and distributed roughly 22,000 copies across America. He basically made it the dominant sorting tool for schools, for courts, and for immigration screening at Ellis Island.
Wow.
Yeah, and he's also the one who coined the clinical classifications of moron, imbecile, and idiot, which, remember, were actual medical diagnoses at the time.
And this is where the records make the direct connection to adoption, right? Because the University of Oregon's Adoption History Project and the work of historian Ellen Herman, they document Goddard's explicitly published views on this. In 1913, in material published by his own institution, the Vineland Training School, Goddard called adoption, quote, a crime against those yet unborn.
We have to look at his underlying logic there. Why would he call it a crime? Because Goddard argued that unmarried mothers were presumptively feeble-minded. To him, an out-of-wedlock pregnancy wasn't a social issue or a moral failing. It was literal proof of a hereditary genetic defect.
Right.
And he believed that placing their children with respectable middle-class families risked contaminating the gene pool, because those children would eventually grow up, pass as normal in society, and reproduce.
So he basically advocated for institutional segregation. They keep the mothers locked away, keep the children in institutions, because letting them assimilate into families through adoption would allow these so-called hereditary defects to just spread unnoticed.
Yeah.
But wait, I just want to clarify this for the listener. So the exact same man building the massive testing infrastructure to sort American school children by race and class, the guy administering these tests at Ellis Island, he was simultaneously publishing material treating illegitimate birth as a hereditary defect.
It is not a metaphor. It is the exact same person. It's the exact same logic.
That's wow. But I'm trying to picture the logistics of this on the ground.
Yeah.
Because you can't exactly give a newborn infant an IQ test. So how were social workers in the 1920s and 30s actually applying the sorting logic to a baby? Were they just, judging the biological mother's background?
That is precisely what they were doing, and they were doing it with the full endorsement of the federal government. To understand the practical application of this, we really have to look at the legal architecture that cemented this mindset, specifically the 1927 Supreme Court ruling, Buck v. Bell.
Right. That's the infamous case where the Supreme Court, in an 8-1 decision written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, upheld Virginia's compulsory sterilization law.
Yes. And look at how they justified overriding a person's bodily autonomy in that case. They cited 3 generations of a family's presumed hereditary defect. Justice Holmes infamously wrote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. The woman at the center of this, Carrie Buck, was sterilized under this law. But the historical research, specifically the work of Paul Lombardo at Johns Hopkins, established that Carrie Buck had absolutely no hereditary impairment whatsoever.
She was a rape victim.
Yes. Her pregnancy was the result of a sexual assault by a relative of her foster family. Her institutionalization was a complete cover-up just to protect the family's reputation. So the state fabricated evidence of a hereditary defect. The Supreme Court used that fabricated evidence to legally sterilize her, and that 1927 ruling has never been formally overturned.
Never formally overturned. And the model sterilization law used in that era was drafted by Harry Laughlin of the Eugenics Record Office, a guy who is deeply embedded in the exact same network as Terman and Goddard. And that very same model law was later cited as a direct influence by the Nazi Defense Council at the Nuremberg trials.
So this is the intellectual and legal climate in which the modern adoption system was constructed. The state was perfectly willing to fabricate medical history to manage populations. And this exact environment birthed a philosophy known as matching theory. Matching theory was the absolute dominant adoption placement philosophy of the era.
So how did matching theory actually play out? Like, what were the rubrics being used by the agencies?
They applied the sort by heredity logic directly to infants. Social workers would evaluate a relinquished infant's presumed inherited traits. They would literally document the baby's eye shape, hair color, earlobe structure, alongside the biological family's history of so-called defect. And then they would painstakingly pair that infant with adoptive parents of similar physical stock and religious background.
The explicit goal was to produce families that looked as though the child had been biologically born to them. Like, if the kid looks just like the parents, the neighbors never have to know.
Exactly. So the fake birth certificate, that counterfeit document we talked about earlier, it wasn't just some bureaucratic side effect. It wasn't an accident. It was the final administrative endpoint. If your whole philosophy is trying to build a perfect family by matching hereditary traits, that piece of paper is the state slamming the door shut and saying, look, biologically, nothing to see here. You sort the infants, you place them to simulate biology, and then you issue a state-sanctioned document that locks the truth in a vault forever.
You know, you might be listening to this and thinking this bureaucratic obsession with bloodlines is a uniquely American flaw, like a byproduct of our specific history with eugenics and our hyper-bureaucratic state. But the historical data shows this wasn't a localized bug at all. It was an exported feature. Look at what happened when this exact same logic was applied on a massive scale in Australia.
Right. Between 1950 and 1975, Australia ran what is now known as the baby scoop era. And we are talking about a massive, massive scale. An estimated 150,000 to 250,000 people were affected. And this wasn't just a cultural trend where young mothers felt, a bit pressured. It was a systemic engineered practice. A 2012 Australian Senate inquiry found widespread illegal conduct by named actors. We're talking doctors, nurses, social workers, religious figures, forcibly or coercively taking babies from unmarried mothers.
And the medical records from this era show that the harm was profoundly physical, not just emotional. Women leaving these maternity wards were routinely administered a drug called stilbostrol to suppress lactation.
We really need to pause on how this was justified administratively. The hospitals weren't giving this drug for the mother's health.
No.
They were doing it to physically enforce the separation. By shutting down the mother's natural biological response milk production, they could process her discharge faster and cement the reality that her baby was gone. But stilbostrol has since been linked to severe multi-generational physical consequences.
Right. Elevated cancer risks, infertility, arthritis. This wasn't some metaphorical intergenerational trauma. This was a clinical setting, administering a chemical to a woman's body to force it to stop functioning naturally just because her baby was being taken away. And the physical consequences of that chemical run forward through 3 generations of people.
And in Australia, the operative doctrine driving all of this was called clean break theory, which is the exact same conceptual pairing as America's sealed record system. Complete severance of the biological connection, a completely closed paperwork trail, and a systemic presumption that the people most affected, the mothers and the children, had no legitimate interest in ever questioning the decision.
Now, in 2013, the Australian federal government, led by Prime Minister Julia Gillard, officially apologized for these practices. They literally stood up in Parliament and acknowledged what the Senate inquiry had found. And honestly, people might hear that and think, well, they investigated it, they uncovered the truth, the Prime Minister apologized. Doesn't that resolve it? Like, at least the system finally worked.
Yeah, but it raises a really uncomfortable question about what accountability actually means, because the data aggressively dismantles that assumption. An apology is not access.
Right.
Despite the official apologies, the original birth records in several Australian states are still not fully open. The institutional logic of the closed record persists. Saying you are sorry does not hand an adult back the birth certificate that tells them who they actually are. The apology essentially served as a release valve for public pressure. It ended the system's perceived obligation, while the actual systemic erasure remains completely intact.
Which brings us right up to today, June 30, 2026. And the modern consequences of these paperwork fictions, because the material we're looking at highlights a major Supreme Court decision handed down just this morning. In a 6-3 ruling, the court struck down Trump's executive order on birthright citizenship. Now, the sources obviously acknowledge this ruling as a major constitutional victory.
Yes, absolutely.
But they immediately point out a massive, devastating blind spot that this ruling completely ignores.
And that blind spot is the population of international adoptees who are currently being deported under a Department of Homeland Security initiative called Operation True Parent.
To really understand how someone adopted by American parents can be deported, we have to look at the mechanics of the Child Citizenship Act of 2000. When this law was passed to supposedly streamline citizenship for foreign-born adoptees, it included a very specific arbitrary cutoff date. It dictated that children who were adopted internationally and brought to the U.S. before February 2001 did not receive automatic citizenship. They were supposed to be naturalized through a standard paperwork process.
But for tens of thousands of them, that paperwork was never completed. Why? Because the system was totally opaque. Adoptive parents often assumed the adoption agencies handled the naturalization, or they simply didn't know an extra legal step was required. So the result is this huge population of people who were adopted as infants, raised entirely in America, who speak only English, who are legally stateless.
Wow.
And they usually only find out when they try to apply for a passport or a driver's license in their 20s or 30s.
And here is the vicious, horrific irony of the whole thing. These are people who hold fabricated American birth certificates. Documents issued by the states they grew up in, legally listing American citizens as their biological parents.
Think about the mechanics of that. The machinery of adoption fabricated the exact document that assimilated them into American life. It made them American in the eyes of their communities, their schools, their employers. And now the federal government is using the bureaucratic gap in the Child Citizenship Act to deport them to countries they have absolutely no memory of for not being American enough.
Yeah.
The paperwork system that erased their origins is now rejecting its own fiction just to kick them out of the country.
And when you look at the data from the omission platform, which scores government policies on what they actually deliver versus what they claim to guarantee,
Right.
the Child Citizenship Act scores a 9 out of 100.
9.
A 9. That massive gap between the law's intent and its administrative reality has literally become a deportation mechanism for international adoptees.
So if we synthesize this entire journey, we really have to recognize the underlying pattern here. Lewis Terman, Henry Herbert Gard, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, matching theory, the fabricated birth certificate, the citizenship gaps. What becomes incredibly clear is that this system was not built via some shadowy, smoke-filled room conspiracy.
No, you don't need a conspiracy when you have aligned incentives. It was a machine built by people who wanted to manage heredity, sort populations, and protect systemic fictions. The exact same people built the adoption secrecy system at the exact same time they were building the school tracking system. The logic was identical.
And they reinforce each other, right? The school system utilized standardized testing to train a population to follow instructions, accept their designated track, and fundamentally not question institutional authority.
Right.
And that same conditioning was applied to adoption. You hand a person a fabricated origin story before they are old enough to interrogate it, and you trust that society has been conditioned well enough not to ask questions.
But the reality is that illusion is breaking. 16 states already have unrestricted original birth certificate access for adoptees. 8 of those states opened their records in just the last 6 years. And across all of them, the data shows there's been zero fiscal impact.
None.
The sky didn't fall. The administrative chaos that was always threatened never materialized.
The long-held justification that birth parents demand the secrecy is crumbling because the birth parents themselves are dismantling it. Look at the testimony of Susan Dushage Alexander. She's a licensed therapist and a birth mother who testified before the committee. She stated it perfectly. She said, "California birth parents do not need protection from our children.
Exactly.
The protection was never for the families. It was a mechanism to keep the institutional fiction airtight."
Which brings us right back to room 437 today. For 90 years, a population trained by these exact systems not to ask questions never demanded that the machine stop.
But today, they did ask. The adoptees, the birth parents, the adoptive parents, they all showed up in that room. They interrogated the system. They demanded their own paperwork. And the only thing protecting the status quo wasn't a logical argument. It wasn't a moral defense. It was just empty chairs. The imperative here is incredibly clear. Fill the chairs. Demand the system justify itself, and when it can't, dismantle the secrecy.
It's a really heavy forensic reality to process, but I want to leave you with one final lingering question to mull over on your own. If a legal system can successfully fabricate your literal origin story at birth, legally mandate that you live by it, and convince the entire public that it was done for your own protection, what other foundational truths about our society are just well-maintained paperwork fictions, surviving only because we haven't demanded to see the original documents?